My name is Lauren Woodside, and I'm the Risk and Resilience Manager for Food for the Hungry. And I'm joined by my colleagues today here, Josh Ayers and Mary DeCoster and Claire Boswell. We're really glad that you've joined us for this session on early warning for early action toward a more behaviorally informed early warning systems. And to get started, we're going to share with you whoops, don't look at that yet. We're going to share with you this site. If you can go to ahaslides.com/UR2020FH. You can also use the QR code to join. Go ahead and join the presentation, and you'll be able to follow along. And we have several kind of interactive slides that we'll use, and that will allow you to respond as we go through the presentation. So we definitely want to hear from you. Go ahead and join the slides there. And just so you all know, also, we're recording this session, so just so you're aware. All right, I think there are some of you who haven't joined the session yet, so if you, to join the slide share, you can either do it from your computer or from your cell phone as well. For those of you who have just joined us, we're asking folks to go ahead and join us on ahaslides.com/UR2020FH. And you can also use the QR code there to join. And that will allow you to respond and participate in the slides and questions that we have that are participatory. Still got some folks joining. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and move on with our first question. We want to kind of know from this group, what is your experience with early warning systems? So go ahead and answer. Do you have experience with community-based early warning systems, maybe data collection or the technology for data collection, data analysis, modeling or forecasting, perhaps forecast-based financing, hazard and risk communication, informing policy and response preparations? Just kind of get an idea where our experiences lie. For those of you who have just joined, you can access all the answers and questions to the poll at ahaslides.com/UR2020FH. It's up at the top of the screen. And we have several interactive parts to our presentation today, so happy to hear from you. So as we see, we have a lot of people with hazard and risk communication experience. Looks like kind of a tie between informing policy and response preparations and data analysis, modeling and forecasting, and also community-based early warning systems. So I think we're going to keep on going so we can get to all the great content we have to share with you in time today. Going to move on. Last year, the World Meteorological Organization held their second what is it, global conference for multi-hazard early warnings. And one of the kind of key takeaways that they had from that they posted in a tweet said that science and technology and big data saves lives, but communication is key. Warnings must be useful, they must be usable, be used, address real user problems, and inform viable user responses. I think we all here agree to that statement, and we want to see early warning systems really leading to early action. But it's a challenge. And one of the participants from that conference shared, I think, really well, that early warning is important, but only if it works, results into action by communities. It must reach the last meter. The last mile is not enough. And we hear that a lot, you know, we want to get to the last mile, but that last mile is not enough. We want to reach the very last meter. So we want to hear from you. Go ahead and take a moment to respond to this question. You can use one word or up to 3 words in a phrase. How can we get early warning systems beyond the last mile and all the way to the last meter? For those of you who are just joining us, you can respond to the questions on our slides. We have lots of interactive slides in our presentation by going to ahaslides.com/UR2020FH. It's at the top of the screen, and you'll be able to interact with us throughout the presentation. So we're seeing kind of some interesting ideas here. Communication is a big one. Community engagement, impact-based forecasting, accessibility is also really important. Participation, I see, is kind of key coming up. And lots of other really important points you all have raised. Yep, those are great. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get involved in the main content part of the presentation, and I'm going to hand this over to Josh Ayers.
Hi, my name is Josh. I'm the Senior Risk and Resilience Advisor at Food for the Hungry. And I love whoever put funding up there. I appreciate the honesty. Sometimes it's just that simple. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background of sort of the problem that the team that I was a part of was sort of trying to study. And yeah, for the last 15 years or so, we've seen a renewed emphasis on what people are calling social constructivist understandings of risk. What do I mean by that? Dennis Milletti, in the social roots of, actually Kathleen Tierney's Social Roots of Risk book, quotes Dennis Milletti and says, all risks and losses, whether associated with so-called natural perils or technological ones, are the result of decisions that communities, societies, organizations, and political actors make or fail to make. Tierney goes on to state that societal values and ingrained practices, ideologies, worldviews, various forms of social cognition, belief systems, collectives, other types of social constructions and ideas that become influential through forms of collective behavior all play a role in the social production of risk. I see Kevin Blanchard is on this, in this group. and I'm sure he would love to talk more about the social roots of risk and how risk is socially constructed, and his campaign on no natural disasters. So it's good to see you here, Kevin. But really, that's as this social and arguably more human understanding of the formation of risk and resilience to natural and man-made hazards developed, there's been a corresponding awakening, I think, of early warning system practitioners and policymakers to more people-centered approaches, and I saw that in the word cloud as well. So, for example, the Hyogo framework introduced people-centered early warning systems, calling for systems that encourage and enable people to take action to reduce and build resilience. They even went a step further to say they called for the inclusion of traditional and indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage, and I saw some of references in the word cloud to that as well. Tailoring the information to target audiences and taking into account social and cultural factors. So they're really emphasizing that word encourage. You know, it moves beyond just sort of providing the information, right? But really, how do we mobilize people to take early action when they receive these warnings? UNDRR's platform for the promotion of early warning, PPEW, they clarified their objective for PCEWs, PCEWSs as the empowerment of individuals and communities threatened by hazards to act in sufficient time and in appropriate manner to reduce their own injury and loss and damage. But despite the shift towards more people-centered early warning systems, the idea of encouraging people to act, like the Hyogo framework has done, it's conspicuously absent, I think, from early warning literature, and that's what our team has found. Early warning literature, policy, best practices continue to focus on sort of allowing or enabling, right? Just providing the information and communicating it. And so a lot of the focus has been on the warning information and how that information is communicated and disseminated. Move on to the next slide, Lauren. Quote to you from the IFRC, actually, that was 8 years ago. This is 8 years old. It says, early warning systems are only as good as the actions they catalyze. Action is an essential part of any warning system. If a warning is sounded and no one takes the action that the warning was intended to trigger, then the warning system failed. Traditionally, the chief function of an early warning system is to collect and analyze and share data and maps and trends on hazards and vulnerabilities in a standardized, systematic way. But taken as a highly technical process, administered by experts, these functions of early warning systems are typically viewed as sort of the easiest, most technically straightforward, and often strongest aspects of the system. But it gets hard, it's complicated and complex when you start to consider the sociological and cultural issues that influence the usefulness, the practical usefulness of early warning information. Endorsement and ownership, issues of trust and perceptions of reliability of the message and the messenger, and the cultural and contextual relevance of early warning information. Those are all issues that people-centered early warning systems attempt to address. While they have indeed, early warning systems have indeed become more people-centered in the development of the warnings themselves, I think we've made less progress in understanding how to best elicit early preparation and prevention and mitigation actions specifically from the exposed and vulnerable populations themselves. There's been a lot of focus on informing governments and informing early responders, NGOs, donors, right, on what to do and when to do it and for whom to do it. But in terms of influencing the affected populations themselves, I think we've made less progress. So the analysis of the literature, which we did as a team, identified several key cultural, social, and cognitive aspects of people-centered early warning systems. And those include, obviously, participation. A lot of these you've already mentioned in your word clouds. Participation of end users for increased ownership, perceptions of reliability, credibility, trust. culture, gender, ethnicity, and other differences in early warning messaging, participation, and preparedness. And then even things like influencing worldview and risk perception and behavior. So that's where my colleague Claire will pick up, where we pivot in the paper, and we'll share that link at some point, where we pivot in the paper and start talking toward more behaviorally informed aspects of early warning system design and development and implementation. So over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Josh. So I think that brings us to the next logical question. Why should we take a socio-behavioral approach to early warning systems? Where's the gap, and what can it do for us? Traditionally, we saw this throughout the literature that we reviewed, early warning systems have focused on the hazard itself by trying to communicate the risk to a potentially affected population. Frequently, although not always, these warnings do not include a recommended behavior or early action that population can take. I have a picture here of a classic example of that. For those of you who are based in the US, you'll be familiar with this old terrorist threat system, alert system. It was color-coded, and it was supposed to tell us when we were at risk for another terrorist threat. This was implemented after 9/11. But there was no information about what we were supposed to do with this warning. So if I wake up in the morning and hear that it's a threat level orange, what can I do to minimize my risk, or to minimize the impact of a terrorist attack that could happen? I have no idea. So we clearly need to focus on the recommended behaviors and how we can encourage and support people to take those actions. I think this quote, which is from a NOAA document that we reviewed in the paper, sums it up really nicely. Risk perception and risk communication is really important for an early warning system. We know that. It almost always has to be included, but it is not going to be enough. If we don't focus on the behavior and what drives the behavior, we're not going to reach the level of early action that we want to achieve. Thanks, Lauren. So if it's not just risk, then what do we need to focus on? So once we identify those behaviors and have a clear call to action, we have to know what the barriers and the motivators are. What are the determinants? I saw someone put in motivators and barriers in our word cloud, which made me really happy as a social behavior change specialist. And when we reviewed the literature, we looked at studies that applied behavioral theories to some of these emergency preparedness and mitigation responses. And there were a myriad of determinants that came out in these studies. These 7 sort of rose to the top, were the most commonly studied and cited. I'm just going to quickly give a brief explanation of these. Some of them are self-explanatory. And then we're going to have an opportunity to look at some case studies that came out of the literature that we reviewed, and how these play out in a real life situation. So hopefully, give us a little bit more of a concrete example. So the first one is simply perceived benefits of the behavior, or an attitude towards the behavior. This is usually not related to the outcome that the early warning system is interested in. So it's not just, it will save your life, or it will protect your livelihood. This is something collateral. And it could just be a general favorable attitude towards it. What do I think of that behavior? Do I have a positive attitude or a negative one? But it could also be something very concrete. If I do this, then this thing will happen. The next one is trust. Josh mentioned this. This one factors hugely. And it's interesting to note that people tend to have a higher trust in those that they know personally, even if those people are not experts in the hazard or the behavior. And they'll have less trust in people who are distant from them, even if they are even if they are expert in those behaviors or those hazards. The third one is self-efficacy and locus of control. Sort of lumped these together, even though they're a little bit different. Self-efficacy is my belief in my capacity to carry out the behavior. Can I do this behavior? It's specific to a behavior. Locus of control is more general. Do I feel that I have any control over what happens to me? Or do I have a fatalistic approach? What will happen, and there's nothing that I can do. The fourth one is perceived barriers to action or a lack of resources. These can be physical, they can also be social. Do I have what I need to carry out this behavior? Or socially, am I allowed to carry out the behavior? Sort of related to that is social norms, but it could be slightly different. There are two kinds of social norms. One is, what do I see everyone else around me doing? Or what do I think everyone else around me is doing? And the second one is, what do I think everyone else thinks I should do? What do I believe the expectations are for my behavior? Another one is your response or action efficacy. This is simply, do I believe that if I do this behavior, it will work? It will protect me from the hazard. It will achieve the ends that the early warning system is promoting. And then lastly is social, place belonging, sometimes called sense of community. This is most important when the behavior is a collective action behavior for the whole community. So if I feel a strong sense of belonging in a community, I'm more likely to be willing to participate in that collective action with others in my community. So where does that take us? This is the framework that we developed for our paper that we believe would improve these early warning systems and get us to that last meter. You can find this on page 35 of the paper. Lauren, do we have a link we can post in the chat box if people want to access that? So very quickly, just going through these steps, I just talked a lot about the first one, which is identifying what those early actions are. What are the behaviors that we want the population to carry out? And what are the determinants? What are the motivators and the barriers to those behaviors? And then that brings us to steps 2, 3, and 4, which are, what information do people need for this behavior? How can we craft the messaging to promote and encourage that behavior? And then going beyond just promotion, how can we support those behaviors? Because promotion is not always enough, and we'll see that in a couple of our case studies. And then lastly, the step that is in every framework and needs to be in every framework, but that we often don't get to, and that's, are we monitoring, are we evaluating, are we learning from each situation so that we can continue to improve the response to these hazard warnings? Okay, so I think now we're going to go into our case studies. Thanks for putting your questions and things in the chat. Mary is collecting those. What we're going to do in these case studies is we're going to flash the short paragraph up on the screen. As you see, the first one's already up. We're going to give you some time to read that on your own. As you read it, make notes or just think about what stands out to you, what questions you might have. And then we're going to have an opportunity for you to interact. So if you've not yet joined the presentation, please do so now, because that allows you to, answer the question, put your thoughts in so we can hear from you. And then we'll have a short discussion for each one. And hopefully these will just give us, as I said before, a chance to make a real world application of some of these behavioral concepts. So the first one, I simply couldn't resist doing a vaccination case study because of the situation that our world is currently in. So bear with me there. We're going to start with swine flu vaccination in Israel. So take a moment to read that, think it through, and then we'll have a question for you to answer.
And for those of you who are haven't joined yet the presentation, you can do so at the link in the chat box, ahaslides.com/UR2020FH. Should take you there.
Okay, I hope everybody had a chance to read through that. Lauren, if we could go to the question for this one. So it's just a pretty simple question. If you were on staff at the university and you wanted to encourage vaccination among the student body, what kind of information would you put on the flyer? Uh-oh, went too far, Lauren. Thank you. All right, got a few answers. People are still joining, so there are no right or wrong answers to any of these. I will share with you what the study found, but this is not a test. Great, so I see a few people are still joining the presentation and chiming in. Thank you for doing that. It just makes it more fun. And so the option one essentially is the risk communication piece. How serious do these students believe this illness is, and how likely do they believe that they are to get it? And in this study, those who said that they intended to get the vaccine did mention that they took the illness very seriously, and that they thought they were susceptible to it. So that risk perception piece was there for them. Interestingly, though, when students were asked the most likely thing to keep them from getting a vaccine was this piece on safety. So that barrier was really high. Over 2/3 of the students said that they had concerns about the safety of a vaccine and that that affected their intention to be vaccinated. So here we see the point that I was making earlier. Even if your risk perception is very high, it may not be enough if you've not addressed the specific behavior and the determinants of that behavior. And in this case, it was perceived barriers because of concerns about safety. That's what the study found. So we needed, essentially the, the study concluded that you needed to address both. Okay, so thank you for participating there. We're gonna go on to the next one. We're going to move to Indonesia and tsunami evacuation. So again, take a moment to read through that one, think about it, make notes for yourself, and then we'll have a couple of questions. Okay, hopefully you had a chance to read through that one, and those of you who have just joined us are able to join the presentation. So we have a couple questions about this one. Some of you have already answered. But go ahead and answer that question. Again, there's clearly no right or wrong answer to this one. Just what do you think? Looks like inland evacuation for the win. And that is actually what most of the participants in this study did. This was a tsunami warning that, I believe it was 2012. There was an earthquake in these communities that did not result in a tsunami, but the warning went out and 100% of the community evacuated. But the question was, to where did they evacuate? And the vast majority of them evacuated horizontally inland. They did not go to the government constructed vertical buildings. So let's go to the next question. Give you a moment to read through that one and tell me what you think. So all of these determinants were a part of the study. Which one do you think was the most critical? About half of you have responded. There's no wrong answer, so feel free to just choose one. Okay, so it does look like trust for the win. This is the one that the study found to be extremely influential. So again, in this situation, the risk perception was very high. Everyone in the study evacuated. So the perceived susceptibility and severity was there. The question was, which behavior, where did they evacuate? And most people evacuated horizontally because that's what their friends and their neighbors did. And they trusted them more than they trusted the government officials. That's not to say that there wasn't a blatant mistrust of the officials. It was just in that moment, who am I going to listen to when I have to make a quick decision? It's going to be the people closest to me. And so that's what the study found was extremely influential in this case. Great, thank you for participating in that one. Let's move on to Kenya. So once again, take a moment to read through this, make notes, think about it, and we'll have a couple of questions. Okay, great. So let's look at our questions for this one. All right, so this is just your opinion. What do you think Gagalo should do? He has three choices that we have presented to you anyway. You have three choices. So far, no one is in favor of urban migration. Got a close running between selling cattle and trekking farther. So in the interest of time, we'll just go ahead here. It looks like more people believe that he should trek farther. This is a really tricky one, not based on a study that we reviewed from the literature review, but based on our actual work. And there is no easy answer. The biggest problem with the early warning systems in this part of the world is that we've not yet identified the behaviors that will protect the affected population. So Gallo hears on the radio that the forecast is that the drought will be long, that the rains will not come soon, but no advice is given on what he should do with that information. So he's in a bit of a quandary. He makes that decision on his own. The point here is that whenever possible, our early warning systems do need to have that clear call to action. There needs to be a recommended behavior. And if we don't know what it is, we need to do some formative research. And this is exactly what we had planned to do as our next step after this paper, was to go do some formative research in this part of Kenya and learn from the population, see if we could discover what these recommended behaviors would be. Unfortunately, like everyone else, our plans changed last spring. We still hope to do it at some point, but this is a really difficult situation, as I'm sure some of you are familiar with these complicated scenarios in the places where you're working. So let's go on to the last one, which is the US-based one that many of us are very familiar with, which is Hurricane Katrina. So again, take your time, read through that one, and we'll ask some questions. Okay, let's go to the question. I think there's just one for this one. All right, so what do you think prevented Justin and Lily from evacuating? Again, there is no right or wrong answer here. Yeah, it looks like most people answered that was the perceived severity and the late warning. In this study, all four of these factors to the right, all except the perceived susceptibility, came out very strongly. These were focus groups done with mostly men from the lower 9th ward who did not evacuate. And these, all four of these factors, the lack of resources, the lack of access to buses, the perceived negative consequences, and then the issue of perceived severity or the late mandatory evacuation order, all featured really prominently. And this one is super important because it appeared that the motivation was not necessarily low for evacuation, but people simply didn't have what they needed to get out. If you recall, the hurricane hit at the end of the month. People were waiting for payday. And even though they may have had cars, they didn't have the money to put gas in it, and they didn't have money to go somewhere for a hotel or wherever they might evacuate to. The bus issue was interesting because it was a physical barrier, but there was also the perceived issue of racism. Most of the men who were interviewed were African American, and they believed that the fact that the buses didn't come into their neighborhoods was because of blatant racism. They also had a concern that if they had tried to leave, they would have to go through wealthier white neighborhoods, and believed that they would not be allowed to do so. There was a very strong mistrust of the police, not just that the police would not protect their homes, but concerns that the police would actually participate in the looting. And then this whole issue of the late mandatory evacuation was extremely important. The question here is, even if we had been able to increase perceived severity, if the mandatory evacuation order had come earlier, would it have been enough to overcome these other barriers? My personal opinion is it's better not to find out. We can increase the perceived severity, but we also need to address this issue of supporting people to carry out the behavior. So thinking about what people might need to actually carry out that early action that we're looking for. I saw a little bit in the chat where people were talking about the issue of lived experiences. This is super interesting, and we see that it can be either a motivator or a barrier. In the tsunami situation, it was a motivator. People had lived through it; they knew how bad it was. In this study, which I didn't mention that it is one of the options, but it was in the case study. Many of the respondents mentioned that they had ridden out previous hurricanes. If you've lived in New Orleans for any time at all, you have experienced a threat of a hurricane or an actual hurricane. And they mentioned hurricanes like Hurricane Betsy that hit decades ago. Well, we rode that one out, so this one will be fine as well. So it can be either a positive or a negative when it comes to encouraging that action. Is definitely an important factor in many cases. So thank you for that, Lauren. And I think we have one more general question, don't we? Yes. So now what we're going to ask you to do is thinking about all four of these case studies that we've just looked at and the framework that we shared with you, which again is on page 35 of the paper. If you're able to access that link, let us know your thoughts about which step of that framework could have improved the early warning system in one of these case studies, and how you think it might have improved it. So identify the case study. You can just say Indonesia or tsunami or whatever. And then which step of the 5 in the framework you believe was the most critical for improving, and then just a sentence or so about how you think it could have improved it. So again, those steps are identifying the behavior and the behavioral determinants. The second one is early warning information. The third one is early warning messaging. The fourth one is supporting the behaviors, and the fifth one is the monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So
Claire,
take a moment.
you type those into the chat box as well?
Yes.
Those 5?
I can do that. Yeah, so take a moment to go ahead and let us know your thoughts. It's brief, I know, but we're a big enough group that unfortunately we can't have a good discussion. So let's see. First one is IDing. All right, so we have one who's talking about Northern Kenya messaging. It would have been critical to provide clear direction from the government. Right, good point. Excellent, thank you for that. Okay, so Katrina, step 4, supporting that behavior. Yep, so awareness of severity is important. That's one of the behavioral determinants, but really supporting that behavior. And the buses, that was, we've all probably read multiple studies and rehashed the failures of Hurricane Katrina, but that's an important one, the evacuation buses that were never mobilized. Yeah, and for the vaccine case study, identifying those determinants. Yep. Be great if somebody were doing that research now in the US or across the world, all of us, for the COVID vaccine. Definitely step 5. Yeah, and we have the advantage right now in these case studies of looking back, and we've had the after action review, so we can make these recommendations. That we don't always have that luxury. That is a super important step. Thank you for that. All right, 1 or 2 more people want to share a thought, and then we'll move on to Q&A. I think there have been some really good comments I've seen just flashing up, and I want to give a chance. And I actually think we have the authors of one of our papers on this, on the call, so I want to give a chance for discussion. Oh, great, a couple more. Indonesia, knowing the determinant that affects evacuation behavior, excellent. Tsunami behavioral determinants and messaging, excellent. Kenya drought. Yep, applying a behavioral approach, improving the quality of information. Yeah, helping people make those good decisions, super. Land planning, yeah. That's interesting for the tsunami. Thank you for that. Yes, and in Katrina, yep. Early actions need to be part of impact messaging, indication of timelines. Yeah, the timeline featured very prominently, unfortunately, in the Katrina example. Okay, I would love to get to your questions and comments. I think we have quite a bit of knowledge and expertise here in the virtual room. And so we'd love to hear from you. I'm going to hand it over to Mary to facilitate the Q&A.
Thanks, Claire. That was fascinating. And I love all the participation. So Josh, some of the early questions came up, or comments came up during your segment. So I'm going to ask you to jump in. There was Richi Ono said, thanks for mentioning the PPEW and HFA. I was at the UNISDR Bonn office, helped produce the people-centered ESW. Do you want to comment on that?
I did not see that one.
Okay.
I do want to respond. I do want to respond to Lisa Robinson's question. Why do you think the sector hasn't incorporated this knowledge into early warning BRR systems yet?
Go for it.
I think that's really at sort of the crux of what we're trying to sort of get at and better understand and try and make a way forward. I think one of the key points that comes out in the paper highlights Northern Kenya as sort of an ongoing case study through the paper, is that many of these early warning systems are already baked in a lot of ways, right? They're already designed and being implemented. And often, most often, those early warning systems, when they're in the design phases, start from the perspective of the hazard, right? What's the hazard? How does it function? What technology can we use to monitor that hazard? And how do we communicate best, information about that hazard? But I think what our framework that we propose in the paper are to sort of flip it a bit, and from the beginning, from step one, is to start from a behavioral perspective. So what is it that these folks, what kinds of information and when do they need it? What kinds of information do these people need, the affected population? What kind of information do they need in order to take the actions that they would prefer to take? Because I think that starting from that perspective, I think definitely better informs not only how you communicate and when you communicate, but even what you communicate and what data you need to collect in order to communicate those things. So for example, in northern Kenya, the early system is informed by things like rain gauges to monitor actual rainfall and that sort of thing. But really what most informs where pastoralists move their herds is things like pasture conditions and water points, but also the socio-political aspects of where they're allowed to go between tribes and between different groups, and how that access is negotiated or not negotiated. So there's a lot of socio-political factors that go on there that I think could better inform that early warning system. So I would say it's partly because of how they're designed, and just the scale of early warning systems. I know we're getting short on time, but the scale of early warning systems tend to be quite large, right? But the kinds of activities that we're advocating for with our framework are quite local and very sort of based on communities and people groups and sort of those very granular level considerations. And so I think there's opportunities here for local NGOs and local organizations, grassroots community leaders to really engage locally within their sphere of influence, I think, to take that information that is available there and translate it into something that's useful. And I think that's what we're arguing for, is that NGOs get more engaged with that aspect, not only trying to mobilize people to take early actions that they prefer to take themselves, but also actually helping to resource those decisions, sort of like the Katrina example. As an NGO, what could we do to help resource these folks to take those actions that they themselves have identified are preferred? So.
Thanks, Josh. And Josh, you had mentioned that, that one of the authors that we used and admired in our work was in the room. Do you want to identify that person and maybe give them a second?
Yeah, no, I was the one that said that. So we have Jamie McCoffey in our group, and I'm actually I'm super humbled. I think if I'd known that you were coming, I wouldn't have used your study. But I would love to give you a chance to talk about the tsunami evacuation study that you did, and tell us a little bit more about that and what you found. I think you can unmute yourself. I don't think we need to do it for you. So
yeah. Well, I can return. I'm also super humbled that I tuned into this topic, which I have interest in. And then there's this study that we did with our colleagues at ACE, and a very interesting presentation. And actually, as you set it up, that first case study, I found it very analogous to what we found with tsunami evacuation, where you had identified that people took the disease seriously, but the hesitance with the vaccine was concern about safety of the vaccine. And we found something very analogous with the case of the tsunami evacuation. People for sure, and one of the questions or comments came in chat about lived experience, and that is very much present in ACE, understandably. So people take tsunami very seriously. Their risk perception is very high. Their concern is that building safe? Will it survive another tsunami? And that was the piece that hadn't quite worked. And so we found that both concerns about the building safety and trusting the immediate, as you highlighted completely well, very well, trusting their immediate family and friend environments, this combination was what was motivating people. Although they understood the risk, they understood they might not reach a safe area in time, evacuating horizontally over this fairly flat city, they might not be able to reach that horizontal destination in time, but nonetheless, they thought that that maybe gave them a better chance than that building.
Thank you so much. It's so great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that excellent study. I
Um,
think we're out of time, aren't we, Mary? Is there maybe one more question that we can get to?
I'm going to pop. Okay, there's, yeah, I think it's, yes, it is time to wrap up, but we can probably take one more point. A number of people commented on trust, and I wondered, Claire, if you would like to, I popped their comments back into the chat box again. I wondered if you'd like to say a few words on trust to kind of take us out at the end. Because
yeah, I mean, I don't think I can add any more than the excellent comments. I'm just skimming them, but trust is really a tricky one because it's sort of a no-win situation. If people believe you and take the action, and then the worst case scenario doesn't happen, then they sort of take you less seriously next time. I actually think we've seen a bit of this with the COVID response, at least here in the US. I don't know how it's been in other parts of the world, but the warning came through very strongly early on, and many of our communities locked down quite tightly. And then, okay, I don't know anybody who's gotten this thing. I haven't gotten it. Is it really that big of a deal? So the trust is a really, really tricky situation. And, Josh made the point that our forecasting is getting better. But I think it's always going to be something that we're going to struggle with. So I appreciate the comments that folks have made on that one. Others may have more to say about that. You may be less pessimistic than I am about solving that conundrum.
Well, it's an important thing to bear in mind and to consider in your planning, like how can you build trust in people, and how can you promote, the intended behavior or the hoped for behavior, and then have them trust you enough to actually try it out. So just want to thank everyone. You may see there's some Google group that we've kind of temporarily formed in case you want more. And we do hope you'll read the paper. The links in the chat for the Google group. Okay, instead of on the screen, it's on the screen right now. But maybe you can't, oh, I see, they can't click it. They're not going to kick us right out. But yeah, we do need, another group will be coming behind us soon. So Lauren, are you able to put the link for the Google group right into the chat so that they can actually click on it instead of having to copy it out? So that's coming. And thank you all. Rebecca's comment. Let's read that.
Yes, thanks everybody for your participation, and we really would love to get a discussion going on the Google group. I'd love to hear from the rest of you. We didn't have as much time as we had hoped and planned for the Q&A. We'd love to hear from everybody and your expertise. And Phil, thanks for posting the link to the paper again. We'd love your feedback on the paper as well.
And this session has been recorded, so those of you that may have come in late or something, will have another shot at it, I think. So thank you again.
Super. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.